young man that finds himself in some very difficult circumstances. And if you were to research it, these things, many of these things that happen are among the most traumatic things that can happen to a person. And yet it never changes the fact that he remains faithful to God. So I'm pretty excited as we get into this. We're going to do the first 4 verses of this, although we're not going to get much into the first 4 verses because, again, we're going to do a lot of background here. But let's start with Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel into the king's seat and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. Let's bow for a word of prayer. Father, thank you for this book, and thank you for the example of Daniel. A lot of difficult things that he had to endure, and while many others were going astray and blending in and trying not to cause waves, Daniel was simply trying to live righteous before you. And so hopefully we can identify with him. Because of a lot of the challenges that he faced in times past, we face here today. They may look a little differently, but at their core, they're the same problems that keep us from being effective in serving you. And so I pray that as we dig into this study, we would see a young man who was willing to be used of you in some pretty unique and crazy situations. Come what may, it didn't change his resolve and the way he purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. And I trust that we would, on purpose, serve you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Daniel is, this book is about Daniel. It's all about his life. He is a contemporary of Ezekiel, but Ezekiel was much older. And so Ezekiel writes a lot about the beginning of being taken over, and Daniel has a lot more to say later on. His name is very interesting, and we'll talk about that here in a minute when we also talk about his 3 counterparts. But his name, Judgment of God, or God is my judge. And it's interesting that God would choose to use someone whose name is actually a warning to the nation of Israel. Listen, because of the way you have chosen to live, and because you keep rebelling against me, and because you keep forsaking me, a lot of folks are going to get carried off, but the one whose name symbolizes God's judgment is actually going to be the one who stands up and amounts to anything for God, while many others did not. He is from the tribe of Judah. Most people think he was of the royal family. The royal family by this time is rather large. And many times in this part of history, when someone would come in and conquer a land, if you wanted to make sure that they didn't rise up in rebellion against you, one of the easiest ways of doing that was either take all the royal family captive or kill them all. We'll get, a little bit later here, we'll get to God's mercy in this whole situation, because sometimes in the midst of difficulty, it's hard for us to realize that, number one, God is in control, and number two, that he is always merciful. But I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves. He is of the royal family, and so he would have been sought out to be taken prisoner. Babylonians had this wonderful idea. They decided, listen, if we're going to live in peace with all these folks and they're going to pay us taxes and things are going to go well, then we got to keep them from rising up against us. So let's take some of the brightest and the best among them, and we will take them back to Babylon. We will teach them a Chaldean tongue. We'll give them Chaldean names. We'll try to get them to convert to the Chaldean religion, and we'll make them Babylonian. And then they'll like it so much they will not revolt. Now, it worked and it didn't work. It worked because of the thousands and thousands that they actually took captive when, 3 kings later, he says, you may go back and rebuild the temple and the walls. They have a difficult time getting a whole bunch of folks to travel back because everybody's comfortable. So of the folks that they took to Babylon, it worked pretty well. They assimilated in. Now, many of them tried to stay Jewish, okay? They tried to preserve their bloodlines. They tried to stay Jewish, but they became very comfortable in captivity. The problem is the folks that were left back at Jerusalem, you have taken the doctors, the lawyers, the blacksmiths, and all the politicians. And so you've left the folks back in Israel in a pretty bad state. And as soon as they started to get a little bit stronger and get more organized, they were always constantly wanting to revolt. So it worked, but it didn't work. It was a sound idea anyway. Rather than killing all these kids that had promise, let's take them back home and make them productive. One thing that you have to see when you study the book of Daniel is faithfulness. I mean, this is unbelievable. Daniel is taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar. Okay? Nebuchadnezzar comes off the throne for a while, and Belshazzar takes his place. After Belshazzar, you have Darius. And he remained in office under the Medo-Persian Cyrus. Lived approximately 90 years old, rough estimate. That is a long time for this time period, and especially considering the stress and all the changes that have happened in his life and being kidnapped basically from Israel and transported to Babylon. 4 different kings served under the entire reign of 3 kings and still ministered to a 4th king. And in studying this in years past and in dealing with this, I am convinced that the wise men came from the east, probably Persia, because of the influence of this man, even though he only had a few years to deal with Cyrus. He was so effective, and he was so well known, and he was so highly thought of by many of the folks that when the Medes and the Persians take over the Babylonians, his influence goes back to Persia, and that's why they're looking for the Christ child when his star appears. From history, we don't know of any other reason why they would have been looking for something that really would not have made sense to them, except as it is revealed by Daniel. The book, 12 chapters. Very interesting. You can divide it right in the middle. The first 6 chapters, 1 through 6, are historical. It is all about what happens to Daniel and the folks that are taken prisoner, and all the things that happen, the whole lion's den, all that situation. Chapters 7 through 12 are prophetical. A lot of prophecy in there. Some of it very, very difficult to understand. But again, as you're studying Daniel, one of the things that I find very, very interesting about this man is God did not take him and throw him right into a prominent position. We'll look at it as we go through it, but he served Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar brought them over. He intended to put them in the court. He intended to see how far they could rise in government. He intended for them to be useful. When Belshazzar takes over the throne, we don't hear of Daniel being in a prominent position. When Belshazzar has trouble, he calls for the magicians and he calls for the wise men, and Daniel is not among them. That is a very interesting omission in Scripture. It tells us that Belshazzar has his own folks that he trusted. But when nobody could solve the problem, someone mentions to him, hey, wait a minute. Your dad had a phenomenal guy here that's not in your court, and his name was Daniel. And so they send for Daniel, and Daniel obviously solves the problems. And then you have Darius, and he has an interesting relationship with Darius. You see, Darius trusts him so much he's almost like a close friend. And when he gets thrown in the lion's den, Darius is up all night long trying to figure out how he can undo this wrong that has happened, but he knows he can't. According to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, it's written in stone. So very, very interesting that the rise and fall of power, and yet Daniel remains such an influential person. And then much later in his life, God chooses to start revealing the prophecy to him. Reminds me of Moses. You'd think, well, why didn't Moses just go straight out of the king's palace with all that learning and become the leader of the nation of Israel? Why did he have to spend 40 years in the backside of the desert in Midian, just being a shepherd? I mean, that doesn't really make any sense. How much stuff did he forget in 40 years that he could have used right out of college, so to speak? But that's not the way God works. He brought him up in the palace life. He brought him up with education. He brought him up with authority. And then he took him to the backside of the desert to teach him humility. And then when he was ready, he brought him into his 40 years of service. And so we see that goes on with Daniel too. Reminds me also of Joseph. Joseph has a dream, and everything's supposed to be peaches and cream, right? I mean, his whole life is going to be great. People are bowing down to him, and how much better does it get? And then you're sold into slavery. You say, wait a minute, nobody bowing down to me. I'm bowing down to everybody else. That's not exactly how the dream was supposed to go. How much worse can it get? Be careful about that. When you're a slave, it doesn't seem like it could get any worse, and then he finds himself in prison, and it got a whole lot worse, didn't it? And yet, God used that whole circumstance to show that he is always in control. That is the theme of the book of Daniel. God is in control. Now, when you start reading this first chapter, it's very easy to look at it and say, it doesn't seem like he's in control. The nation of Israel is in chaos. They're kidnapping people and stealing stuff, and then they're going to come back later and tear down the wall and burn the temple. And, how in the world can God be in control? But as he writes this, he wants us to know that God is in control. We're going to see that because 6 kingdoms are mentioned in the book of Daniel. And so while he is sharing with the prophecy, God reveals to him about kingdoms that are yet to happen. And we see, well, wait a second. Yes, God is in control. He rises up people and he tears down kingdoms. And he goes through and he lists them. With each of the kingdoms, he has a symbol, and then he also has a creature that kind of symbolizes what the kingdom is like. The first one is Babylon, and we'll get there, I don't know, maybe 2 years from now. Who knows how fast we'll go through here. But this creature has a head of gold. That's Babylon, signified by a winged lion. Now, when you think about a lion, you think of nothing. There we go. Strong, powerful. Well, winged lion would indicate fast and strong. All right? Then you have the second one, the Medo-Persian Empire, the arms and the chest of silver, and signified by a bear. Now, lion's king of the jungle, and he roars mighty, the whole deal, but they call it a bear hug for a reason, right? Bears squeeze ever loving daylights out of you until you feel like your head's going to fly off. And that's exactly the Medo-Persian Empire. They just wrap themselves around kingdoms and absolutely, totally dominate. Then you have Greece, the thighs of brass, symbolized by a leopard, great speed. Boy, if you've ever seen a leopard run, it is impressive. Absolutely unbelievable how fast a leopard can run. And that's what the Greeks did. When they wanted to conquer somebody, they hit them so fast they didn't even know what was coming. While they were getting the troops ready, they already were in there hacking and whacking. And then you have the legs of iron, symbolizing the Roman Empire. And it's symbolized by a dreadful beast. That's very interesting to me, that he can come up with a lion, a bear, and a leopard, but then you have this dreadful beast. How do you describe the Roman Empire? Well, it's tough, because if you look at history, you can say, well, the Babylonians controlled this part of the country, and the Greeks controlled this part of the country, and the Medo-Persians controlled this part of the country. Look at the map. Rome controlled the whole known world, except for China at the time. You look at a map of the Roman Empire and it was everywhere. And that's why he says dreadful beast. Not only was it strong, not only was it fast, not only did it squeeze the daylights out of you, but it was so dominant that it affected every part of everyone's life everywhere. Well, God is in control, right? That's what he's trying to portray through us, through Daniel. So what better civilization, shall we say, to be in control when Jesus Christ is born than to have a universal language and have good paved roads and have safe travel throughout the whole known world. Then the last two that are presented in the book of Daniel is the Antichrist, 10 toes and a little horn, and then the kingdom of Christ, the smiting stone that fills the earth, and he is referred to as the Ancient of Days. It's a little interesting to me that the Antichrist isn't described, and his kingdom isn't described the same as Christ. Kind of knowing Satan, that probably bothers him a great deal because that's all he really wants to do. He wants to usurp the throne of God and be like him. God doesn't even give him that honor in his prophecy. Let's dig into this and see. There are four main folks that the beginning here of Daniel talks about. And I always find this interesting. When I was principal at the school, I'd share with kids in Bible class all the time. This speaks volumes about what was going on in the nation of Israel at that time period. Ashpenaz is told to take all these folks, and we read the criteria for taking all these, probably thousands of folks that were hauled off to Babylon. But in the beginning of this book, do you realize that of the thousands of Jewish young people that were taken to Babylon, God only has something to say about 4? He only has something to say about 4. And Daniel starts it. So you wonder, if Daniel wasn't willing to stand up and stand alone, would the other 3 have eventually caved, or would they have stood up and been counted for Christ? Let's look at these 4 individuals real quickly by way of introduction here. Hananiah means the grace of the Lord. Okay, now think about that for a minute. We are introduced to him as someone who is literally captured and hauled off to Babylon. And yet he is named the grace of the Lord. I mean, please tell me where grace is supposed to be pouring out of this situation. Then you have Mishael, he that is the strong God. Well, you know from, if you studied any of the Greeks or Romans or gods and all that kind of nonsense that sometimes they make you study in school. If one country conquered another country, they believed it was because their God was superior, right? I mean, it kind of makes sense. If your God was so all great and mighty and everything, then why would he allow you to be conquered by my God? Is the humanistic thinking that goes on behind that. So here you have a young man who is being taken to Babylon, and his name literally means he that is the strong God. And can you imagine? Ashpenaz is probably driving along in his chariot, and he's supposed to give new names to these young folks and start assimilating them into their culture. And he's sitting here thinking, he that is a strong God? Yeah, I don't think so. Your whole country's in wreck. Your half your temples gold and silver is in our wagons back here, and we have thousands of you hauled off. Your king is in disarray, and you're paying taxes to us. Who is the strong God now? But God isn't done yet. Azariah is the other one. The Lord is a help. Are you starting to see a little irony here? I mean, the 4 people that he picks out to stand out in this early chapter, you have God is my judge, and then you have the grace of the Lord, he that is the strong God, and the Lord is a help. And it doesn't seem like any of that's going on in the beginning of the book. They get their names changed. You say, why do they change their names? Oh, there's several reasons. Number one, it showed their authority over them. How many of you don't like your name? Guess what? My wife tells me this all the time. You don't get to pick. I didn't get to pick my name either. I'm okay with my first name. I don't care for my middle name too much. But my mom and dad didn't ask me. They did what? They named me. Pippa's getting ready to be born here before too long. Does she get a say in her name? No. Mom and dad have made that decision. Did Jackson and Sawyer get a say in their name? How rude. I'm going to talk to them a little bit later about that. You say no. Why? Because they don't have the authority to deal with that. Now, in our country, at a certain age, if you want to, you can change your name to Numbers. Ocho Cinco. Because that's a good name. People never cease to amaze me. I mean, come on. Whatever happened to Roy? But they're showing their authority over them. Oh yeah, by the way, you used to be he that is a strong God, but now you're going to be what I say you're going to be. The other thing is it shows their subjection to him. Because from now on, are these folks going to run around and call them their Hebrew names? No. They're going to run around and call them by their Chaldean names. It also, because of their intent to be naturalized citizens. If you're going to fit in with our society, then you have to sound like you belong. You have to look like you belong. And the last reason is they wanted them to forget about their God, and they wanted them to focus on their new pagan ones. We can't necessarily force you to, but we can do everything possible to make it sound good to you. Daniel becomes Belteshazzar. The meaning of this is keeper of the hidden treasures of Bel. Now, this is pretty interesting to me. I don't know if they saw something special in Daniel. But Daniel shows himself to be a very wise individual. And often people think of wisdom as being a hidden treasure. We talk about, common sense. Well, you know that common sense isn't very common, right? Maybe I should start calling it uncommon sense. I don't know. But his name, literally, it's also like you are a smart one because of, not God, Bel, this idolatrous person. Hananiah becomes Shadrach, inspiration of the sun. They worshipped the sun. You get your inspiration from the sun. Mishael becomes Meshach, means of the goddess Shak, a form of Venus worship. Boy, they took that kid's beautiful sounding name and made it about as mundane as it gets. He that is the strong God becomes of the goddess Shek. Azariah becomes Abednego, servant of the shining fire. So every time they spoke their name, they were invoking a pagan deity and saying, listen, if you are to become anything in the Babylonian Empire, it's going to be because of these references to the pagan deity. And yet, we see God is in control because of the thousands that are taken. These 4 individuals stand up not because of anything they do for an idolatrous God, not because of anything they do that's in and of Babylon itself. They actually stand out in history because of their separation from everything that Babylon is trying to do to them. You can't miss the sovereignty of God here in verses 1 through 3. The first thing in the timing. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem. This is actually the very first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. So he has not been king for very long when he recognizes, no, wait a second, we're having some problems over in Israel, and so he comes to besiege it. God knew exactly what he was going to do, he knew exactly when he was going to do it, and he knew exactly by whom he was going to do it. Go with me real quickly to Isaiah 11:11. Sometimes in the midst of tragedy and difficult situations, we tend to feel like we are alone. And God has left us out here to flounder. Isaiah 11:11, it says, "And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria and from Egypt and from Pathros and from Cush and from Elam and from Shinar and from Hamath and from the islands of the sea." Now, question. It says he sets his hand the second time. Is that because he couldn't do it right the first time? No. The first captivity was supposed to turn their hearts back to him. And they want to repent, and so he starts gathering the people back together again. But guess what? They have not learned their lesson. And so he has to send them into captivity again. And he scatters them again. And now the second time he's bringing them back. Look at how many people have been able to dominate the nation of Israel. And then think with me for just a minute. Rewind real quickly. All the way back to Joshua. And he promises Joshua what? Be strong and of a good courage. Why? No one shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. But wait a second. We got to get the people that are left from Assyria and Egypt and Pathros and from Cush and Elam and Shinar and Hamath and from the islands of the sea. What happened to all people couldn't dominate you? What happened to we are supposed to be the chosen people? Well, wait a second. That promise was conditional, wasn't it? Conditional upon what? Conditional upon being faithful to him. And so even though it looks like this huge tragedy is going on, God reminds us in Isaiah that this is not the first time he has had to deal with the nation of Israel, and it's not going to be the last. I also want you to see the severity here. Because in verse 2 he says, "And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand." In other words, Nebuchadnezzar's siege was successful. Now, when you lay siege to a city, what do? You surround it and do what? You just absolutely starve them into submission. You want food? Come and get it, and we'll kill you. What, you're running out of water? We'll come out and dig a well, and we'll kill you. In fact, show your head too long on the wall, and we'll kill you. And if somebody's not paying attention, we'll sneak in and kill you. A siege is not a nice thing that happens. We read in other places, Jeremiah and things like that, where sieges are so horrible, they're trying to sell a donkey's head for a ridiculous amount of money. How much meat do you think is on a starving donkey's head? Who wants to eat a donkey's head? Well, now wait a minute though, because the siege is so bad that two women sat down and argued over about who was going to kill their baby first and boil it and eat it. Right? And the fight becomes exaggerated because the one lady gives in, so they kill her baby and eat it. And then when it comes time to eat the other one, they can't find that baby and she's hiding it. It's like, whoa, wait a minute, that's not the deal. We're supposed to eat both of them. How bad do things have to get when you sit down and argue over whose baby you kill first for survival? A siege is not a nice thing. Not a nice thing in any regard. Do you think that the Babylonian army absolutely and thoroughly enjoyed being encamped around Jerusalem, besieging that city? Or do you think they would rather be home in Babylon with their family and friends? So when they finally get inside the walls, what do you expect would happen? Tell you what would happen if I was doing it. I'd be killing everybody. Right? Why didn't you just quit 6 months ago, 7 months ago, a year ago? However long the siege takes, why didn't you just give up then and not make me sleep out here in this dusty tent for a year? I'd be taking it out on some people when I got inside. But do you see what happens here in verse 2? We read through here and we go, man, this is not a good situation, but God's still in control. When they get inside the city, they're pretty nice about it. With part of the vessels of the house of God. What pagan person that just spent thousands, millions of dollars besieging your city for however long, when they get down into the walls and they break into the temple and they see gold and silver all over the place, who takes part of it? Can you imagine a thief robbing your house? Please don't get up and leave right now because you're worried about it. Somebody breaks into your house right now. You have $1,000 sitting on the counter. They count out $200 and leave the rest for you because, you wouldn't want to leave the person in hardship or anything. You say, no, they're taking all of it. They're taking everything of value they can find. That's not what happens. This long siege has been going on. They're trying to put down rebellion, and he only takes part of the vessels of the temple? You tell me God's not in control. He carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. And the king spake to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel. Certain of them. And again, you see the sovereignty of God. You look